So now let's look at our board one more time here. How does the heart break? As a result of the oppression. Now, I know this looks like a lot of chaos, and I can definitely simplify it, okay? I can definitely simplify it. But the principle is the heart breaks after it's been hardened. Where's the point of hardening? Right here. That's the point of hardening. Okay, so now I think you can potentially understand how the demons play a role. Now remember, it's a people oppressing them, but they're what? Their God is a principality. And the principality is a commander of demons. Okay? The principality is a commander of demons. Now, the function of that process starts to make sense when you see what comes next. All right? This is important. As the oppression occurs, there's a point where there's a crying out. And this point right here is where salvation is activated. Activated. By what? By calling on the name of the Lord. Okay? So the crying out is calling on the name of the Lord. Now, why is this significant? Remember, this is the cycle of Israel. Okay? The cycle of Israel. There's a couple things that I want to say. The first one is that every time that there was a infestation, it eventually resulted in oppression and then eventually in possession. What do I mean by that? The scripture, okay, so let me explain to you something in ancient Hebrew context. In ancient times, okay, the Hebrews believed that once you sold something, now it was the possession of the person who owned it. So the scripture says that in Judges that when the people of Israel were actually in a state of disobedience, that he sold them to the nations around them, and they began to oppress them. So the principle is that you have an infestation, which is a leftover, something that's left that should have been eradicated. That infestation then moves into oppression, where they begin to what? Control the people. For example, they were not allowed. The Philistines didn't allow any blacksmiths in the Philistines didn't allow any blacksmiths in Israel because they might make weapons. And so the Israelites had to go to the Philistines to sharpen their weapons. That is oppression. That is oppression. Now, the premise is that in that oppression, there is a point of possession. In other words, that they are no longer a sovereign entity. Israel's no longer a sovereign entity. They are absolutely under the control of another nation. And in that possession, now that demon of the Philistines, which would have been probably Dagon, they had a bunch, but Dagon seems to be the superior of those in Ashkelon. now has possession of the people of Israel. Until what point? The people of Israel cry out to God. They cry out to God, and what happens? As they cry out to God, there is a function in which basically now those people are no longer the Father's possession, and in that same principle, they begin to ask God to deliver them. Now, here's what I want you to think about. When that occurs, at that time period, under whose jurisdiction are they? They are under the jurisdiction of the demon as a result of the contract that they signed to begin with. But now here's the part that's important. Demons and angels are not above us, but actually under us. Make no mistake, Psalm chapter 8 does not say you have made him a little bit lower than the angels. It says you have made him a little bit lower than the Elohim, which we could get into what that means, but it's not the angels. Now, when we look at this function, here's what you need to understand. The contract exists because you believe it exists. Remember, Yahweh told Israel, an enemy will attack you, infestation, and they will flee from you 5 ways. And then in Deuteronomy 28, in the part where the curses are, it says you will be the tail and not the head. An enemy will attack you 1 way and you will flee 5 ways. A changing of authority. Okay? Now, the reason this is important is because when there's the crying out, then there's the moment of what? There's the moment after the crying out where salvation is activated. What is that? That's the point in time where God reneges on the contract, where he now gets involved and brings a deliverance. But what's interesting is there's a legality here, okay? There's a legality here, a contract between the people and the demon. Now, the reason, remember, these are human beings oppressing other human beings. That's important for you to remember. These are human beings oppressing other human beings, but they are under what? A contract with a demon. Therefore, the final ownership sits in the context of the demon. Now, where this becomes important is once we start to get into salvation, we have some questions that need answered. So question number 1 was, did they lose their salvation? Did Israel lose their salvation? Well, let's talk a minute about this. Here's our cycle. Okay? We will start at the focus of absolute obedience. So you have absolute obedience, right? This is where you are balanced in your relationship with the Father and your relationship with the children of men. Okay? And so you are a son of God and a son of man. And here's how it works. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. And you love your neighbor as yourself. And within those functions, you are in balance of obedience to what? To the rest of the commandments. In other words, what activates love the Lord your God with all your heart, and what activates love your neighbor as yourself, our obedience to what? To the commandments of Torah, of social justice. The opposite of human sacrifice. The opposite of the other horrible things that the nations around them were doing. You see, this is a part that people don't understand. The only way you can love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your might, and the only way you can love your neighbor as yourself, is through the obedience of the other commandments. That's what he means by they hang on that. They're dependent on that. Okay? And so in that principle, then, as we move in, and listen, remember, we're just dealing with the cycle of Israel. You take this however you want. But we're dealing with the nation of Israel and what pattern we see with them. And so now from the obedience, now comes the increase. You'll be the head and not the tail. Blessed will be your kneading bowls. Blessed will be your crops, etc., etc. Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 15, 1 through 14. So basically then there's a principle: as you begin to increase, you begin to what? Be satiated of your hungers. Your desires are realized. And as your desires are realized, you begin to forget who your God is. And as you begin to forget, and remember, I'm talking about Israel here. So now they are being blessed. They're the head and not the tail. They're the superior nation of all the nations around them. And God has got them walled in, secure, angels assisting, blah, blah, blah. And they begin to forget who's causing the rain to fall and the sun to shine. They begin to forget why they are blessed: because of obedience. They begin to forget. Remember, Deuteronomy 28 begins with the clause, if you will keep my commandments, right? So now the principle is now all of a sudden they begin to forget, and the blessing and the increase is still coming, all right? Because they have not yet entered into sin, which is a combination of serving God and serving this over here. So as you begin to move away from obedience to Torah, because remember, the commandments are a force of benefit, and they are a force of provision, protection, and instruction as promises. Okay? And so as you begin to be disobedient to those instructions, that force of benefit begins to shift. As it begins to shift and you start to move towards sin, they're moving towards sin now. They're starting to kind of sniff around and go after other gods. Then there's a shift in who's protecting. The angels pull back. They're no longer it's no longer a process of an enemy attacking you and you being protected, and subtly and slowly moving into oppression, because there's a point in time where they realize that they forgot their God. They realize that they forgot obedience. They realize that they did the wrong thing, and yet they like that principle of being in that nation. Boom. Oppression is activated. As soon as oppression is activated, they have to harden their heart to get past that moment of continuing in sin. It's like a harbinger. It's like a warning. And then what happens is they continue to step into what we would call iniquity. Iniquity is the principle of sinning with a hardened heart or sinning without conscience. Remember, it says if a Gentile does the things of Torah, he shows the law written on his heart, his conscience accusing or defending him, then we have that principle of your conscience no longer accusing or defending you. Then there's that moment of possession. And at that moment of possession, it is not about some sort of inhabitant within you that controls your body, but instead ownership. You have completed a contract. You've entered into a contract with a principality, and that principality now has ownership, which means you no longer have protections. You are treated however you are treated, and you have to worship that thing. You have to bow before that thing that possesses you, and you cry out. All who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. That salvation equates to the premise of what? A deliverance from the possessor, a deliverance from the oppression. Okay? That doesn't necessarily equate to obedience, because we will have a tendency to fake the funk. We'll pretend like we are being obedient, but our heart isn't completely broken yet until that moment when he draws us back into the flock. And we are reminded of the blessings. And we are reminded of the table fellowship. And are reminded of that moment of truth. Then our obedience will be genuine and begin, and intention will be there again. There's a transition period between this point and this point where we are obedient, because we think that that will get us removed from the calamity. But it's not until we're out of the calamity and we are reintroduced to obedience and increase where we actually see our moment of true intention. Now, there are some that would argue that the moment you get saved, you start to be obedient. And you see this, right? There's this honeymoon period with Christians where when they first get saved, they say the sinner's prayer, and all of a sudden they are told that they're new, that they're renewed, that everything's different. And they go and they buy a Bible and they try to quit cursing and quit smoking dope or quit drinking or whatever. And now all of a sudden they're in this energy of life and this wonderful thing until the first adversity hits, and boom, they're back in it again. And then they step into that moment of going, oh, this isn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. And they go into this moment, and that's that transition, the purple area right here, that's that transition between the moment of salvation and the moment of obedience. Because it's not as much about, it's about that idea that, oh, God saved me, therefore I'm going to be obedient, as opposed to when there's that moment of intention and it actually gets real. And now there's a choice that needs to be made on obedience. It's that first time you fall, that first time you stumble, you come out the other side and you have that conviction in your heart. And there's this moment where you're like, oh my gosh, it's not going to be as easy as I thought to be obedient. And you start to be obedient. And you just go one day at a time, getting through it, making it happen. Okay? Now, the reason why this is important is because there's two really relevant things here. Okay? The first one is going to be when it says that God sold his people to the Midianites or to the Moabites or whoever is oppressing them, is he completely disassociating himself from them, or is he just removing his covering? And that's the question that you need to ask yourself. When he lets them go off into oppression, are they still his people or not? Well, there's a couple things that we need to think about here, okay? So the first one is probably going to be the covenant with Abraham through Isaac shall your seed be called. In other words, this promise that he makes to Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant, which is a land covenant. Remember, the principle is that there was a stronger entity in the land than Abraham, and so a covenant was made with that entity who happened to also be the owner of the land, Yahweh. Okay? Now, the dysfunction comes into play when we have Ishmael and Isaac involved. And so Yahweh makes it clear that through Isaac shall your name be, right? And Isaac gets the covenant given to him through the inheritance from Abraham. Then from Abraham, we get to Jacob, and Jacob receives the blessing from Isaac and receives the inheritance of the land. And therefore, the promised land that was promised to Abraham, not Isaac, not Jacob, not Israel, not the Palestinians, not the Syrians, not the Iraqi government, not Jordan, but Abraham. But then Yahweh chooses the child of promise to be the seed, so that what? So that inheritance comes through adoption. And that's important. And when I say adoption, what I mean is that Abraham had to shift the firstborn status from Ishmael to Isaac. Isaac was Abraham's firstborn. And so as a function of that, we can now see that then Isaac moves into Jacob instead of Esau. Esau was the firstborn. Same thing, adoption. And then from Jacob into Ephraim, Ephraim is in the adoption. And Joseph is considered the firstborn. Now, the principle is then as we get into this idea, we can see an inheritance of promise from Abraham down into the children of Israel who are under oppression in Egypt. And so when we start to get into the Parashah Bo, we see something very interesting occurring, and that is that there's an opportunity for obedience that results in the salvation of the firstborn of the children of Israel. But notice, if there's no blood on the doorpost, it doesn't matter whether you're an Israelite or whether you are an Egyptian. And so what's interesting is as we get into that thought process, we begin to realize that all of the firstborn of Egypt were condemned to die, whether they were in Israel or whether they were in Egypt. The only thing that afforded a deliverance from the angel of death was what? It was that concept of the blood on the doorpost. What was the blood on the doorpost evidence of? Someone who had chosen to enter into table fellowship with God. They ate the sacrifice, and the blood on the doorpost said, I slaughtered the animal. I'm eating with God tonight. You needn't come in. Okay? Now, what's intriguing is that doesn't equate to an Israelite necessarily being delivered. That equates to anybody who puts the blood on the doorpost, which means an Egyptian could have done it, or an Israelite, which is still that evidence of Joseph delivering the nation of Egypt, right? Saving the world. Yahweh saved the world through that slavery and then that oppression that he went through, and eventually deliverance into the state of statesmanship, and then eventually having that seat of agency from Pharaoh. All of that was brought about to save the world, and now here's Yahweh again giving Egypt a chance to live. Look at the plague of the hail. In the plague of the hail, Moses tells Pharaoh, bring your livestock in, this is going to be bad. Pharaoh's officials fear Moses and do it, but a lot of people didn't. Now, the hail did not fall in the land of Goshen, which shows there's still a distinction, and that's what we're going to get into here, is that Yahweh promised something to Abraham, and now it was being carried out as a promise to this nation who was in oppression as a result of going after other gods. Now, we don't see that necessarily in the text, do we? But what we do see is an activation of oppression. We see an activation of crying out. We see them when they're in the wilderness saying they want to go back. We see that they're cherishing, or they are reminiscing of these things that they enjoyed in Egypt, right? As soon as Moses goes up on the mountain, the first thing they do is they activate a principality over them in the golden calf. You see, there's evidence here that Israel was in oppression because of disobedience. And that disobedience resulted in oppression that eventually it resulted in crying out. But you notice they don't begin to become obedient. Let me show you what I mean. They don't begin to become obedient until after the Exodus. What do I mean by that? They were told not to have any leaven in their homes. And yet it says the only reason why they didn't have leaven when they left is because they left in a hurry. Meaning what? They still had leaven in their homes. And I'll bet you if they stayed another night, they would have still had leaven. So the principle is that you see these people being obedient, putting the blood on the doorposts. Okay? But not everyone was obedient in that way. Not everyone had demonstrated that situation, because why? There was a crying out in Egypt of the people who were dying.